So, you might think the way the world works now, with countries mostly respecting each other's borders, has always been the deal.
Yeah, it feels kind of permanent, doesn't it?
Right. But imagine a time when European maps literally had Jerusalem right smack in the center. Not as a symbol, but like geographically central in their worldview.
That's a mind bender.
Or think about the U.S., a nation built on sovereignty, having this really complicated, almost back and forth thing with the whole idea of a global balance of power, sometimes defending it, other times really condemning it.
Absolutely. It's not straightforward at all.
Okay, let's try and unpack this. Because today on the Deep Dive, we're really going deep into how world order evolved, looking through the lens of Henry Kissinger's work, World Order.
And what's so interesting digging into Kissinger's analysis is just the sheer historical sweep. We're not just talking abstract theories here.
No, definitely not.
We're looking at real historical moments. You know, the deals made at the Congress of Vienna, the whole rise and fall of the Ottoman Empire, the impact of Islamism, and how different big players around the globe approached order in totally different ways.
These are the forces that really shape the world we live in now, right?
Exactly. These historical moments are the bedrock.
So we're drawing on Kissinger's insights from these key periods. And our mission, really, is to pull out the main ideas, the principles that have shaped how nations deal with each other, understand the challenges that keep cropping up, and, well, hopefully make a bit more sense of our current global situation, which can feel pretty confusing.
Yeah, to give listeners a solid grasp without it feeling like a dense textbook.
Exactly. We want you to get the nuances without your head spinning. So with all this history, where do we even begin to make sense of it all?
Well, a logical place to start, and Kissinger really emphasizes this, is the Westphalian system.
Westphalia?
Yeah. And it's crucial to get that this wasn't like born from some grand vision. It was really a practical fix after decades of just brutal, pointless religious wars in Europe.
So sheer exhaustion, basically.
Pretty much. Imagine a whole continent just worn out by fighting, where the very fabric of society was ripping apart. The Peace of Westphalia was kind of a way for these powers to just coexist, even if they fundamentally disagreed on religion and everything else.
Okay. So out of all that fighting came these basic ground rules. To stop that kind of religious war happening again, what were the core concepts?
The big ones were sovereign states, this idea that each state is boss within its own borders, no outside interference, and linked to that, non-interference in what other states do domestically.
Don't meddle.
Right. And alongside that, the balance of power, the idea that you keep things stable if no single country gets way too strong and threatens everyone else. So you needed alliances to kind of check ambitions.
Thanks.
But Kissinger argues the real genius of Westphalia wasn't just agreeing on sovereignty, it was accepting this multi-state system as the way forward. That was radical compared to centuries of everyone trying to claim universal authority.
So it was stepping back from those huge universal claims like the Pope being in charge of all Christian kings towards something more, well, practical, dealing with the reality of lots of independent players.
Precisely. Kissinger highlights that philosophical shift, moving from seeking one big truth to focusing on the practical, the ecumenical, trying to build order out of all these different states and interests, not trying to force them into one mold.
It's such a contrast to that medieval world you mentioned, with Jerusalem at the center, reflecting this unified, God-given order.
Totally different mindset.
It's almost weird to think about that unified ideal now. Kissinger mentions Charles V, right? That Habsburg ruler in the 16th century.
Yeah, powerful guy.
Who, through these incredibly clever marriages, the saying, let others wage war, you, happy Austria, marry, briefly controlled this massive chunk of Europe. For a second, it must have looked like that unified thing might come back.
But it was just a moment, as Kissinger points out. That dream quickly fell apart. Three big things basically smashed the medieval ideal.
Okay, what were they?
First, the age of discovery. Suddenly Europe realized the world was way bigger than they thought. Global, not just regional.
Right, new continents, new peoples.
Second, the printing press. Revolutionized how information spread, gave voice to new ideas, challenged the old authorities, religious and political.
Yeah, huge impact. And the third?
The Protestant Reformation.
Martin Luther, challenging the Catholic Church.
Yeah.
That really blew apart the idea of a single, unified Christian world, didn't it?
Absolutely. Luther saying individuals had a direct line to God that hit the church's authority hard, led to this deep, permanent split in Christianity.
And that religious split fueled political fights too, right?
Yeah. Oh, massively. Rulers started backing different religious groups in neighboring countries. It blurred the lines between internal issues and foreign policy. The Reformation basically dismantled that old idea of order based on the Pope and the Holy Roman Emperor, the two swords.
Okay, so into this really messy, volatile situation steps Cardinal Richelieu in France. Kissinger paints him as this incredibly sharp political player,
Definitely.
more interested in France's national interest, the
Yes.
famous raison d'etat, right? The idea that the state's needs come first, even before religion.
Exactly, even though France was supposedly the most Catholic king.
That's the fascinating part. Kissinger shows how Richelieu played the 30 Years' War. He didn't see it just as a religious fight.
No, for him it was about power. It was a chance to weaken the Habsburgs, France's main rival.
So he actually backed the Protestants, even though he was a Catholic cardinal?
He did. He supported Sweden, the Protestant German princes, purely based on what was good for France. He was all about centralizing power in France, making the state the key player. He really paved the way for this Westphalian idea of competing national interests creating a balance.
So the main goal of Westphalia wasn't some high-minded moral quest. It was much more down to earth. Stop the wars from being so huge and destructive.
Pretty much. Move away from these giant conflicts over beliefs towards more limited wars about specific, calculable things like territory.
Want it.
Kissinger sees it as the first real attempt to create an international system based on agreed rules and limits, built on lots of independent states, not one dominant power.
Okay, let's jump forward then.
Yep.
To the 18th and 19th centuries. This balance of power idea really starts to become like the operating system for Europe, and Britain emerges as the key player, the balancer. How did they pull that off?
Well, their navy was absolutely critical. Having control of the seas meant they could jump in on the continent when they needed to.
Selectively.
Exactly. Usually backing the weaker side against whoever was getting too strong, just to keep things level. Kissinger quotes Lord Palmerston, big-time British Foreign Secretary, who basically said Britain wasn't tied to permanent alliances. Their commitment was just to keeping the balance.
So always shifting, always adjusting to stop one country getting ahead.
That's the idea. They'd step in if the balance was off, but they weren't locked into fixed loyalties.
Meanwhile, you see Prussia starting to rise. Frederick the Great. Kissinger talks about how he built up a relatively weak state through, what, discipline and public service.
Yeah, sheer discipline and creating the strong sense of duty to the state. And that 18th century order, it had its own feel. Wars were usually for limited aims, grabbing a piece of territory mostly.
Not total war.
Not yet. And rulers, even while claiming divine right, generally accepted that other monarchs were legitimate too. Plus, practically speaking, they couldn't just raise massive taxes or draft huge armies easily, so wars didn't hit civilians nearly as hard as they would later.
But then comes the Enlightenment, this huge intellectual wave questioning everything, emphasizing reason. Kissinger quotes Alembert on the lively fermentation of minds, right? This explosion of new thinking. How did that affect ideas about world order?
The Enlightenment brought this strong belief in reason, in progress, the idea that humanity could move towards a more just, more peaceful world. Kant, even with all the chaos around him, he imagined a future of permanent peace.
How did he think that would happen?
He talked about our unsocial sociability, how we compete but also cooperate. He thought that plus the sheer horror of wars would eventually push us, rationally, towards a cosmopolitan system of general political security.
A global system for peace.
Yeah. But Kissinger also adds a note of caution here about the Enlightenment.
What's that?
He suggests that maybe this focus on abstract reason led them to underestimate the deeper, messier stuff, history, culture, the non-rational things that also drive people and nations.
That feels important. Like maybe they thought you could just design a perfect system on paper, ignoring how complex societies actually are.
That's a good way to put it. Kissinger often contrasts that Enlightenment rationalism with thinkers like Burke, who emphasized tradition and organic growth. Maybe the Enlightenment folks, focusing on universal ideals, didn't quite grasp how strong particular loyalties are, or the unintended chaos you can unleash when you try to radically remake things.
And that underestimation of the non-rational stuff? Well, it blows up spectacularly with the French Revolution, doesn't it?
Absolutely. Suddenly, it's not just about grabbing territory. It's about universal ideals, overthrowing the entire old system, even using terror against your own people.
And then Napoleon, a totally different kind of leader. His power wasn't inherited. It was from force, from charisma, from conquest. Hegel called him the world spirit on horseback. That's quite an image. What was Kissinger getting at with that?
Hegel's line, as Kissinger uses it, captures how Napoleon seemed to embody the whole spirit of that revolutionary age, this era of massive change, of individual will reshaping history. Napoleon's ambition wasn't limited like the old kings.
He couldn't accept just being part of a balanced system?
No, he needed a French-dominated Europe. His own legitimacy, coming from nowhere basically, was tied to constant winning, constant expansion. He just couldn't really coexist with any other strong, independent power, which in the end led him to overreach disastrously in Spain and Russia.
So it wasn't just the other powers ganging up on him, it was his own inability to stop. He couldn't operate within any kind of limits.
Precisely. That fundamental inability to accept limits, rooted in his personality and the revolution itself, was ultimately his downfall.
Now, in the middle of all this, Kissinger brings in Russia, this huge Eurasian power, always seeming a bit ambiguous, sort of between East and West, maybe not quite in sync with European politics.
Russia's history is definitely unique. The Mongol invasions in the 13th century really cut them off for a long time from what was happening in Western Europe intellectually, economically.
Isolated them.
In many ways, yes. Then, later, after Constantinople fell to the Ottomans in 1453, this idea of the Third Rome emerged. Moscow, seeing itself as the heir to Byzantium, the protector of Orthodox Christianity, gave them this sort of messianic feeling.
So kind of split personality, linked to Europe, but also feeling like this separate, maybe besieged civilization.
Yeah, exactly. Constantly focused on physical security along its huge, often unstable borders. That Dostoevsky quote Kissinger uses really nails it. Russia's ceaseless longing for a great universal church on earth, but at the same time feeling like an orphan cut off from the human family, captures that tension.
It does. So while Western Europe is developing these ideas of balance of power through diplomacy, Russia's learning harder lessons on the Eurasian plains, where survival often meant sheer physical defense of vast lands.
Right, shaped a very different outlook on international relations, often prioritizing concrete security over those more abstract ideas of balance.
Okay, so after Napoleon shakes everything up, the Congress of Vienna meets to try and put Europe back together. Kissinger sees its main achievement as setting up a balance that actually worked for a while, right? Deterred big wars and even brought France back into the fold pretty quickly.
Yes, Vienna was quite successful initially because it combined power with legitimacy. You had the Quadruple Alliance, Britain, Austria, Prussia, Russia, providing the muscle to keep France in check.
Okay.
But also, the shared horror of the Napoleonic Wars created this common interest in preventing more revolutions. And importantly, they were relatively lenient with France, let it rejoin the club, which helped keep the peace for quite a long time.
So shared fear of revolution was a factor, too.
Definitely. Austria, Prussia, Russia, even with their own rivalries, were united by their fear of uprisings at home.
But this Vienna system, it didn't last forever. Kissinger points to nationalism, the 1848 revolutions, the Crimean War.
Yeah.
These things started to unravel it.
Exactly. Nationalism, this idea that people sharing a language and culture should have their own state thinkers like Herder, emphasizing the unique genius of each nation that directly challenged the big multinational empire.
Undermined their legitimacy.
Right. If your ruler was seen as culturally foreign, then the 1848 revolutions just shook everything up, questioned the whole dynastic system, and the Crimean War pitted the major powers against each other over the crumbling Ottoman Empire, showing the cracks in the Vienna Consensus.
And then, boom, World War I. After almost a century of relative peace based on this balance of power and legitimacy, how did it go so wrong? Kissinger argues leaders lost control of their own military plans.
That's a key point, and kind of chilling. For weeks after Archduke Ferdinand was shot, diplomacy was happening, albeit slowly. But once Austria-Hungary sent that ultimatum to Serbia with that super tight deadline in July 1914...
The clock started ticking.
Right. And suddenly, these incredibly detailed, rigid military mobilization plans took over. They were designed for speed, leaving almost no room for diplomats to maneuver. In just a few days, Europe was plunged into this catastrophic war that changed everything.
So after the absolute horror of World War I, the Treaty of Versailles was meant to create a new order based more on legitimacy, like national self-determination. But Kissinger argues it was flawed right from the start.
Yeah, Versailles kind of fell between two stools. It was harsh enough on Germany to create huge resentment, making reconciliation really hard.
They're not harsh enough.
But not harsh enough to actually stop Germany from eventually becoming powerful again. And crucially, Kissinger says it pretty much ignored the power aspect needed for stability.
How so?
It created this belt of new, relatively weak states between Germany and the Soviet Union, unable to resist pressure from either side. Plus, Britain started pulling back from continental commitments, and the U.S.
Went into isolation.
Exactly. After Wilson's initial idealism, which left France already weakened by the war, basically alone trying to enforce the treaty against a Germany itching for revenge, it just wasn't sustainable.
It seems like it failed on both counts. Didn't reconcile Germany, but didn't permanently weaken it either. And the U.S. withdrawal left a huge gap.
Wilson's vision was powerful, but it clashed with the European reality of power politics. When the U.S. pulled out, it really undercut the whole idea of collective security he'd championed.
Okay, fast forward again. After World War II, Germany gets partitioned, which had happened before in history, but now it's different because of the Cold War context.
Totally different. Now the main players shaping the global balance are the U.S. and the Soviet Union, these superpowers way outside Europe itself.
So the European balance just becomes part of their bigger game.
Pretty much.
Yeah.
Europe's equilibrium became a key element in the superpower struggle, especially for the U.S. strategy of containing the Soviets. And NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, formed in '49, that was a massive shift for the U.S.
First peacetime military alliance.
Exactly. Showed a deep, ongoing U.S. commitment to Western Europe's security.
Then the Soviet Union collapses in '91, unexpectedly. And there's this huge wave of optimism, right? Maybe the old rules, balance of power didn't matter anymore.
Yeah, a lot of people thought that. Kissinger notes how talk of power balance was often dismissed as, old thinking.
Relics of the past.
There was this widespread belief that democracy and free markets spreading everywhere would just lead to peace and cooperation automatically. NATO expanding eastward, the EU getting deeper.
With countries giving up some sovereignty.
Right. That reflected this optimistic view. The EU, especially, aimed to unify Europe, overcome old rivalries through cooperation.
But Kissinger points out tensions remained, even inside the EU, like the pull between national politics and the bigger European project, especially during economic crises.
Definitely. European leaders, however committed to the EU, still have to answer to their voters back home. So national interests can clash with EU-wide decisions.
And when things get tough economically.
The EU often has to impose stricter measures to hold things together, which can then strain its legitimacy if people in individual countries don't feel connected to the project or resist the demands being made.
Okay, let's shift gears completely now. Kissinger turns to the Middle East and Islamism, a region he often calls a world in disorder. He talks about its long history of empires, each seeing itself as the center of the world.
The Middle East has this incredibly deep history. Egyptians, Mesopotamians, Persians, huge empires, each with its own idea of order, each thinking it was top dog. By the late 6th century AD, you had the Byzantine and Sassanid Persian empires dominating, but they fought each other to exhaustion.
Creating a power vacuum.
Exactly, which allowed Islam to explode out of Arabia in the 7th century and expand incredibly rapidly.
And then later, the Ottoman Empire. Huge influence, lasted for centuries, but eventually became a factor in the European balance, though often seen as declining the sick man of Europe.
Right. And it's fascinating how the Ottomans, especially later on, tried to play both games. They engaged with the Westphalian system of international law, but also drew on their own Islamic principles.
Especially during World War I.
Yeah. The Sultan, as caliph, called for jihad, appealing to Muslims everywhere to fight the Allies. But at the same time, the Ottoman government was using international law arguments to protest Allied actions. Shows that dual track.
After the Ottomans collapse, you get these autocratic nationalist regimes across the region, often tough internally, but they did engage cautiously with the world order. Attempts at Arab unity, like Nasser linking Egypt and Syria.
They didn't really stick, did they? Those pan-Arab dreams faded as individual states focused more on their own power and identity.
But the one thing that often united them,
opposition to Israel. That was a powerful, consistent, unifying issue across much of the Arab world.
leading to multiple wars. But then Sadat in Egypt makes that huge shift, pursuing peace with Israel based on Egypt's own interests.
A massive turning point. Hugely controversial, cost him his life, but it did break the mold and pave the way eventually for Jordan and others to make their own deals, even if indirectly.
And into this already complex mix comes Islamism as this revolutionary force. Kissinger talks about two main strands, al-Banna and the Muslim Brotherhood, and then Sayyid Qutb.
Right. Al-Banna and the Brotherhood offered this critique of Western decline, calling for a new order based on Islam, with loyalty starting local and building up to a global Islamic system. Qutb, in his book Milestones, was much more radical.
Sounds good.
He basically declared the whole existing world order illegitimate, un-Islamic, called for revolution to overthrow all man-made systems and establish rule purely by divine Islamic law. A declaration of war, really.
Then fast forward to the Arab Spring, early 2010s.
Right.
Lots of initial hope for democracy, but it ran into harsh realities pretty quickly, didn't it? Autocratic regimes, no easy replacements, external powers getting involved.
Yeah, the Arab Spring tragically showed how hard it is to just impose democracy from the outside, especially in places with deep autocratic roots and sectarian splits. Well-meaning interventions sometimes just destabilize things further, like in Egypt initially.
And then Syria. Just horrific. Kissinger argues it wasn't really about democracy versus dictatorship.
More a brutal sectarian fight for power, yeah.
Yeah.
With regional players backing different sides, turning it into a proxy war, and Russia and China blocking intervention based on Westphalian principles, sovereignty, non-interference.
Which just made the humanitarian disaster worse and shattered any regional order.
Syria is just a tragic example of the limits of outside intervention in such a fragmented situation. For many players, it was about sectarian or strategic gain, not democracy. And the big powers disagreeing on fundamentals like intervention just paralyzed any real effort to stop it.
The Palestinian-Israeli issue just grinds on. Kissinger highlights Israel's security worries about giving up land and asks that key question. Even if Arab states recognize Israel, will it actually change things on the ground?
Israel's security calculus is understandable, given its geography. The big unknown is whether diplomatic normalization translates into real grassroots change, moving away from those deep narratives of conflict.
Kissinger also digs into Saudi Arabia. Its unique history, cycles of unity based on strict religious interpretation, the challenge of governing a changing society, and bin Laden's framing of the conflict as existential, leading to global terror.
Saudi history is deeply tied to that conservative religious ideology, shaping its governance and influence. Bin Laden twisted that into an extremist existential fight against the West, leading to al-Qaeda and 9/11, and the U.S. is caught in this tricky spot trying to balance relations with Saudi Arabia and Iran, who are locked in this ancient Sunni-Shia struggle.
Which leads to this really worrying trend Kissinger identifies. States fragmenting across the Muslim world, into Africa too. Power shifting to tribes, sects, creating ungoverned spaces.
That's a huge challenge to the whole Westphalian system, which relies on functioning states with clear borders. This fragmentation fuels instability, gives extremists safe havens, and can easily spill over into neighboring regions.
Moving to another key relationship, the U.S. and Iran. Kissinger notes their fundamentally different views on world order. He quotes Iran's supreme leader, Khamenei, seeing the Arab Spring not as democratic but as an Islamic awakening, rejecting the West.
That highlights the deep ideological gap. Iran, with its long Persian history, has this strong sense of identity, a sophisticated diplomatic tradition, patience, psychology. But since Khomeini, the state is seen not just as serving national interests, but as a tool in a religious struggle, rejecting the Westphalian system for one based on divine law.
And when you add nuclear proliferation fears to that ideological clash, it's incredibly dangerous. Kissinger talks about the risk of preemptive strikes, nukes falling into the wrong hands, and how differently Tehran and the West see Iran's nuclear aims.
More nuclear states just raises the risk of miscalculation, accidents, preemption. Iran's nuclear program is viewed with intense suspicion, leading to huge diplomatic efforts. But the fundamental disagreement on intentions and world order makes a lasting fix really, really hard.
Yet Kissinger also points out that before the '79 revolution, the U.S. and Iran actually had a kind of de facto alliance based on shared opposition to the Soviets and mutual respect for sovereignty. Could something like that, based on non-intervention, be possible again?
Kissinger hints that maybe a pragmatic understanding, respecting sovereignty and agreeing not to meddle internally, could be possible, like before '79. But he also makes it clear that would require a huge shift from Iran dialing back the revolutionary rhetoric and support for groups destabilizing the region.
Okay, let's shift east now. Kissinger looks at Asia, this vast, diverse continent with its own long histories and its own search for order. He notes Asia's incredible rise recently. Japan adopting Western ideas early on, China's massive shift after '79 to economic reform, and a less ideological foreign policy.
Asia's rise is clearly one of the biggest stories of our time. And interestingly, unlike the Middle East sometimes, those Westphalian ideas, sovereignty, non-interference, seem pretty widely accepted in Asia. China emphasizes them constantly, as do many others.
But Kissinger also dives into the deeper history. China seeing itself as the Middle Kingdom, expecting respect, not trying to convert others. Japan's dramatic U-turn after Commodore Perry forced them open, adopting Western ways to resist the West. India's post-independence non-alignment policy.
China's history as the dominant regional power shaped its approach, influence, cultural pull, not necessarily conquest. Japan's Meiji Restoration was this amazing example of deliberate adaptation to survive and compete. And India, since independence, has mostly stuck to non-alignment. And those Westphalian basics, the 5 principles of peaceful coexistence.
But building a stable Asian order faces real hurdles, doesn't it? Old divisions, rivalries between China, Japan, India, unresolved border issues.
Absolutely. The gaps between East and South Asia, the complex rivalries, China versus Japan and the US, India focused on Pakistan. Those are big obstacles to a unified Asian system. It's going to take really skilled diplomacy to manage those tensions and avoid conflict.
Finally, Kissinger turns to the United States. Its unique, maybe even paradoxical approach to world order, expanding across a continent but not in a traditional imperial way, projecting global power but often talking about values, not just national interest, a superpower that often seems uncomfortable with power politics.
America's approach is really rooted in this belief that its own system, democracy, free markets, is universally applicable, inherently superior. From the start, American exceptionalism saw the U.S. as a model, a beacon for the world.
But that idealism hasn't always translated smoothly into foreign policy. Kissinger contrasts Theodore Roosevelt's pragmatism needing force to back up law and balance power with Woodrow Wilson's grand vision to make the world safe for democracy.
Roosevelt was more of a realist about power. Wilson wanted to fundamentally change the whole system based on democratic values and collective security. That tension, realism versus idealism, has run through American foreign policy ever since.
Kissinger traces this through the Cold War, Kennan's containment, Korea, Vietnam, Nixon's opening to China based on pure geopolitics, Reagan's strong belief in American ideals, then the post-Cold War interventions in Afghanistan and Iraq, and the new challenges, nuclear weapons, cyber warfare.
Yeah, the Cold War started with containment, but often had that Wilsonian belief in democracy's ultimate triumph underneath. Korea and Vietnam showed how hard it is to transplant American models elsewhere. Nixon's China move was pure realism, overriding ideology. The post-Cold War era brought new problems, nation-building complexities, nukes, and now cyber, which totally messes with traditional ideas of security and order.
And in our current internet age, Kissinger notes this paradox. We have more information than ever, but maybe less real knowledge or wisdom. He stresses the need for leaders with vision and courage to navigate all this, to balance order and freedom.
It's a key point. Just having data doesn't mean understanding. The sheer speed and volume now can make it harder to focus on what's truly significant, harder for leaders to develop that long-term perspective needed for today's complex world.
So as we wrap up this deep dive, we've covered this huge sweep of history, from Westphalia's foundations to today's complex, sometimes chaotic world. We've seen this constant push and pull between balance of power, legitimacy, and different cultures' ideas of order.
And what's really striking is how relevant so much of this history still feels. We still see echoes of Westphalia in how states theoretically respect borders. The struggle for balance of power is ongoing everywhere, and different ideologies, cultures, histories still shape interactions and cause friction.
And the challenges just seem to keep growing, don't they? Non-state actors with real power, ideologies crossing borders, technology changing everything. It's clear there are no easy answers, no permanent fix for world order.
Ultimately, Kissinger's analysis really drives home the need for a nuanced, historically grounded understanding of how power, culture, and legitimacy all interact. A lasting order can't just be imposed. It has to be built, carefully, respecting diversity and the basic human need for both security and freedom.
Which brings us to a final thought for you to chew on. Given how complex and messy the world is, and knowing that simply imposing order from outside has limits, what genuinely new kinds of global cooperation and understanding do we really need to build a more stable, more just world in the 21st century? Definitely something to think about. Thanks for joining us today.